By late 1943, the battlefields of Europe had become a brutal laboratory of steel and fire. The armored war was evolving faster than any doctrine could keep pace with. And at the center of it all stood the tank. When the United States entered the war, its armored forces were confident in the M4 Sherman, a medium tank built on the ideals of mobility, reliability, and mass production. It wasn't the heaviest or the most powerful, but it could be made in thousands. The logic was simple: quantity over complexity. For the early years of the war, this philosophy worked. Against Italian and early German Panzer IIIs and IVs in North Africa, the Sherman proved effective, agile, reliable, easy to maintain. American crews respected it, even loved it. But as the war dragged on, German engineering began to outpace Allied design. In 1943, on the Eastern Front, a new predator emerged: the Panther tank. Armed with a 75 mm 2K42 L70 gun and wrapped in thick, sloped armor, it could kill any Allied tank before they even reached effective range. When it appeared in Normandy the following summer, Allied tankers were stunned. Reports described shells bouncing harmlessly off its glacis plate, while German rounds punched through Shermans like paper. A veteran U.S. gunner once recalled, "You could hit a Panther 3, 4 or 5 times, and it would just turn its turret and kill you with one shot." The numbers told the same story. In the first weeks after D-Day, the 75 mm guns on most American Shermans couldn't penetrate a Panther's frontal armor at any practical distance. Crews learned to flank, to aim for the thinner sides or rear, but doing so under fire was suicide. Behind the lines, frustration grew. Tank commanders pleaded for better firepower. The Ordnance Department knew the problem. The 75 mm M3 gun had reached its limit. Its high explosive rounds were useful against infantry, but its armor-piercing shells lacked the velocity to challenge modern German designs. So, American engineers went back to the drawing board. At Aberdeen Proving Ground, experiments were already underway on a new weapon, the 76 mm M1 gun, developed from an anti-aircraft cannon design. It offered higher muzzle velocity and improved armor penetration. But development was slow, and bureaucratic friction didn't help. Some commanders still believed the Sherman's speed and numbers were its best assets. They argued, "Don't turn it into a heavy tank." Yet as combat reports from Europe poured in, reality shattered those assumptions. By the time the Allies broke out of Normandy and raced across France in late 1944, German armor was everywhere: Panthers, Tigers, even the monstrous Tiger II. The Sherman 75 mm gun was simply outdated. Field units began receiving the new 76 mm Shermans, but even then, the results were mixed. The improved gun helped, and yes, but it still struggled against a Panther's frontal plate at long range. Tank crews realized they needed more than just a bigger gun. They needed something revolutionary. That revolution would come not from the tank itself, but from what it fired. Somewhere in an American ordnance lab, metallurgists and ballistic engineers were studying an idea that had been floating around since before the war. A round with a dense metal core, fired at incredible velocity. A projectile so fast and so hard it could shear through armor that once seemed invincible. Its name, HVAP, high-velocity armor-piercing ammunition. It wasn't just a shell. It was the beginning of a new age in anti-tank warfare. But before the first HVAP rounds ever reached a Sherman's breech, there was a long uphill battle. One fought not on the battlefield, but in factories, testing ranges, and behind closed doors in Washington. The question was no longer, could the Allies build better tanks, but whether they could build the right kind of ammunition, fast enough to change the outcome of the war. And as 1944 pressed on, that question became urgent, because across the fields of Europe, every day that passed meant more Shermans burning under the guns of Panthers, and something had to change, fast. By the spring of 1944, the U.S. Ordnance Department faced a crisis. The 76 mm gun was ready for mass production, yet on the proving grounds its armor-piercing shells still failed to pierce the thick hide of a Panther's front plate. The reports were demoralizing. Soldiers on the front lines were demanding power. Engineers were delivering theory. In the laboratories, however, a quiet group of specialists believed the answer didn't lie in redesigning the gun, but in reinventing the shell. They looked toward a principle already explored by the British: and perfected in secret German research. Kinetic energy concentration. If a smaller, denser core could be fired faster, it could punch through armor that stopped heavier but slower projectiles. That idea became the M93 HVAP, high-velocity armor-piercing round. Unlike a conventional shell made entirely of steel, the M93 had a core forged from tungsten carbide, one of the hardest substances known to man. The outer aluminum and steel casing simply acted as a carrier, a sabot that dropped away after firing. The core, much lighter and narrower than the standard shell, screamed through the air at over 3,400 feet per second. On impact, its sheer kinetic energy focused into a pinpoint of destruction. Armor that once deflected shells now shattered under the blow. The first field tests at Aberdeen stunned the observers. Against Panther armor plates captured from Europe, the M93 bored through 6 inches of hardened steel at ranges previously unthinkable for a 76mm gun. Engineers and officers watched in silence as the tungsten core smashed through target after target. The data was undeniable. The 76mm gun could now at last kill a Panther head-on, but this triumph came with a price. Tungsten, the miracle metal behind the HVAP, was rare. The United States didn't mine it in abundance. It came mostly from limited deposits in China and Burma, regions disrupted by Japanese control and the chaos of war. Each tungsten core required materials critical to armor-piercing shells, cutting tools, and even aircraft production. Every HVAP round built meant diverting tungsten from other vital uses. Still, field commanders wanted it. Desperately, requests poured in from Europe for immediate shipment. Tank battalions demanded HVAP to give their crews a fighting chance. By July 1944, a limited batch was approved for frontline testing. Shipments trickled across the Atlantic, just a few crates per division. The Ordnance Department knew it couldn't supply everyone, so HVAP was rationed, often reserved for elite units or anti-tank platoons facing heavy. German armored tank crews soon heard rumors about a silver bullet. They called it the magic round. The problem was, hardly anyone had it. In Normandy, Shermans equipped with the new 76mm guns still relied on standard armor-piercing shells, and their performance was disappointing. Panther and Tiger tanks continued to dominate open engagements. Allied tactics adapted around flanking maneuvers, ambushes, and combined air-ground assaults, but morale suffered. Then, in the autumn of 1944, the first small shipments of M93 HVAP reached the European theater. Crews were skeptical at first, until they saw what it could do. Reports began circulating quietly between tank battalions. Panther at 800 yards. Hit through the front. One-shot fireball. HVAP penetrated Tiger side armor at 200 yards. Crew destroyed. For the first time since D-Day, Sherman crews felt something unfamiliar. Confidence. It wasn't widespread yet. For every tank carrying HVAP, there were dozens still loaded with standard rounds. But the psychological shift was real. A weapon that once symbolized inferiority now had a chance at redemption. The U.S. had, at last, found a way to make its medium tank relevant again. Yet even as this breakthrough spread, new challenges emerged. The limited tungsten supply forced rationing. Many crews received only a handful of HVAP shells, sometimes just 3 or 4 per tank. Commanders warned, save them for the Panthers. The round's effectiveness made it a precious resource but also a logistical nightmare. American industry couldn't produce enough to equip every tank on the front. The supply chain struggled to balance priority shipments between Europe and the Pacific, and behind German lines, whispers began circulating among panzer crews. They'd heard stories of Shermans that could suddenly punch through their armor. Some dismissed it as Allied propaganda, others didn't believe it at all. But soon, they would. Because in the frozen forests of Belgium, in one of the most desperate battles of the war, that magic round would reveal its true power. The world would see that technology, even a single shell, could turn the tide of a battlefield. And the Germans, for the first time, would realize that the Sherman's weakness had been replaced with something lethal. The age of the HVAP had begun. For every Sherman crewman in Europe, the war against German armor was personal. They had watched their friends burn inside, thin-skinned tanks that couldn't stand against the firepower of the Reich. The Sherman's reputation, brave but doomed, haunted them. Tankers called their machines Ronsons, after the cigarette lighter slogan, "Lights every time." A single hit from a Panther's 75mm gun could ignite the fuel and ammunition, turning the tank into a fireball within seconds. Survivors spoke of escaping through hatches so hot they burned their hands. Each engagement with German armor was a gamble. Sherman crews relied on cunning, not brute force, to win. They flanked, hid, and coordinated with infantry and artillery. But they knew deep down that a fair fight meant death. That fear created a kind of quiet heroism. Crews went into combat knowing the odds were stacked against them. Some joked darkly about it. Others prayed. But all shared the same hope, that someday something would give them a fighting chance. When the first HVAP rounds arrived, it wasn't just a new shell, it was redemption. Tankers finally held in their hands a weapon that could give them equality, even superiority. The first time a Sherman gunner watched an HVAP round punch through a Panther's armor, disbelief turned into triumph. For those men, it wasn't about engineering or metallurgy. It was about survival and vengeance for every comrade lost inside a burning tank. The HVAP round gave them something priceless in war: belief. The HVAP round wasn't magic. It was science refined into a bullet of pure efficiency. Traditional armor-piercing shells relied on mass and hardness. They were heavy, slow-moving steel projectiles that deformed on impact, transferring energy over time. But against modern sloped armor like the Panthers, these rounds ricocheted harmlessly, even when fired at close range. The M93 HVAP turned that logic upside down. Instead of mass, it relied on velocity and density. At its core lay tungsten carbide, a material almost twice as dense as steel. When fired, the lighter aluminum sabot surrounding the core detached, allowing the smaller penetrator to travel at incredible speed. The result was a projectile moving so fast it didn't so much crush through armor as slice through it. In ballistic tests, HVAP rounds achieved muzzle velocities up to 3,400 feet per second, nearly 1,000 faster than a regular AP shell. At 500 yards, it could penetrate 5.5 inches of armor at a 30-degree angle, more than enough to punch through a Panther's glacis. To the naked eye, the impact was surreal. Standard rounds would bounce or dent the armor. HVAP rounds created a flash, a spark, and then a clean hole straight through. Inside the target tank, the tungsten core often shattered into molten fragments, ricocheting violently, killing the crew instantly. It was small, fast, and merciless, yet as perfect as it seemed. HVAP had one critical flaw: supply. Tungsten carbide required complex refining processes and global coordination. The Allied war machine was stretched thin, and every pound of tungsten was contested between industrial tools, aircraft, and munitions. Still, the science behind it represented something far greater than a single weapon. It marked a turning point in warfare, the beginning of the kinetic energy penetrator age, where speed, not size, became the new measure of lethality. The Sherman's gun hadn't changed much, but what it fired had redefined its soul. Behind every innovation in war lies argument, and the HVAP story was no exception. While tank crews begged for better firepower, the U.S. Army's leadership and ordnance bureaucracy moved cautiously, even stubbornly. General Leslie McNair, a key figure in the U.S. Army ground forces, had long insisted that the Sherman's speed and numbers outweighed the need for heavier guns. He argued that tanks were not meant to fight tanks. That was the job of tank destroyers. The Sherman, he believed, should focus on supporting infantry. That doctrine made sense on paper, but by 1944 it was outdated and deadly. When Sherman units in Normandy met Panthers and Tigers, they weren't facing theoretical tank destroyers. They were fighting for their lives. Officers in the field began pushing back. Reports from France and Belgium filled with urgent pleas. Our guns are ineffective against German armor. We need new ammunition, immediately. At first, those messages were drowned in logistics and politics. Developing HVAP required tungsten, specialized tooling, and changes in manufacturing lines. Ordnance officers worried about cost and consistency. Commanders debated priorities. Should the scarce material go to anti-tank guns or to tanks themselves? But the tide turned as casualty reports grew impossible to ignore. When General Eisenhower's staff began compiling data on tank losses, the imbalance was staggering. Crews were dying faster than replacements could be trained. Something had to change. It was only then, under mounting pressure from both the battlefield and Washington, that the U.S. Army approved accelerated HVAP production and limited field deployment. For once, innovation had forced its way past doctrine, and in doing so, it exposed a truth that every army learns eventually, that war punishes hesitation more than failure. The same decisions made in conference rooms months earlier would soon echo in the forests of Belgium, when American tankers faced their most desperate fight yet. And there, the HVAP round would prove that courage alone wasn't enough. It needed technology to survive. For German Panzer crews, 1944 began with confidence and ended with shock. The Panther, introduced after Kursk, had restored German pride in armored warfare. With its 75mm KWK-42 gun, sloped armor, and precision optics, it could destroy any Allied tank at over a kilometer. Its frontal armor, nearly 80mm thick and sharply angled, was a fortress of steel. To the Germans, Shermans were prey. Reports from Normandy described engagements where a single Panther could knock out half a platoon before the Americans even closed within range. Panther commanders often fought calmly, relying on superior range and fire control to dominate open terrain. They believed their armor was untouchable, especially against the 76mm gun. That belief became a kind of arrogance. Crews stopped fearing frontal attacks, confident no Allied round could penetrate their glacis. Many even refused to reposition after firing, trusting their armor to absorb any return shots. But by late 1944, that confidence began to crack. In scattered reports from the Western Front, German field officers started describing incidents that defied logic. Panthers knocked out by frontal hits from Shermans. At first, they dismissed it as artillery strikes or lucky flanking shots. Then came intelligence briefings mentioning new, high-speed American shells. In one engagement near Stolberg, a Panther commander reported being hit at 900 meters, straight through the front plate. His last transmission before abandoning the tank was simple: "The enemy has a new shell." That realization spread like a ripple through Panzer divisions. Crews began questioning their once invincible protection. Some even ordered extra spare track links welded to their turrets for added armor. The Germans had entered 1944 believing they owned the technological edge. By the end of that year, they were beginning to realize the Allies were catching up. And nothing unsettles an army more than losing the certainty of superiority. For the first time, the hunters felt the unease of becoming the hunted. War is not only fought with machines, it's fought with belief. In 1944, the U.S. armored forces suffered not just mechanical inferiority, but a psychological one. Panther and Tiger tanks had become symbols of German dominance, almost mythic in reputation. Sherman crews fought bravely, but deep down many expected defeat in a one-on-one duel. The arrival of HVAP ammunition began to erode that fear. It wasn't merely the performance that mattered, it was the perception. When tankers knew they carried something that could kill a Panther head-on, their entire behavior on the battlefield changed. They fought with renewed aggression, confidence, and tactical initiative. Commanders noticed it immediately. Units previously cautious in engagement began maneuvering boldly. Tankers who once hesitated now held their ground. Even the Germans observed this shift. Intercepted communications described increased American boldness during tank actions. This psychological transformation mattered as much as the physical results. The balance of morale, always fragile, began to tilt. The Sherman, long dismissed as inferior, had regained its dignity. Strategically, however, HVAP's effect was localized. Limited supply meant only select divisions had access to it. Still, where it appeared, the results were dramatic. Panthers destroyed at long range, ambushes reversed, and German counterattacks blunted. It proved that technological parity could restore faith in men who'd been fighting at a disadvantage for too long. In a sense, HVAP didn't just pierce armor, it pierced doubt. Every miracle in war comes with a cost. For the HVAP round, that cost was tungsten. In 1944, Tungsten was one of the world's most strategic materials, harder than any steel, crucial for machining tools, cutting aircraft components, and producing other advanced munitions. The United States had limited domestic supply and relied heavily on imports from China, Portugal, and Burma. When the HVAP project demanded thousands of tungsten cores, Washington faced a difficult choice: divert material from factories producing aircraft and precision tools, or restrict HVAP distribution to a few elite tank units. The decision was clear. Survival of the war effort depended on aircraft production, so HVAP became a weapon of scarcity. Some tank crews received just 5 rounds per tank, a handful of silver-capped shells hidden like treasure in the ammo racks. Commanders often marked them with chalk, for Panthers only. It was an odd paradox. America's industrial might could produce thousands of tanks a month, but not enough of the tiny metal cores to make those tanks truly deadly. By war's end, only a small fraction of all 76mm rounds fired were HVAP, yet their psychological and tactical impact far outweighed their numbers. In that sense, the story of HVAP was as much about resource warfare as it was about tank combat. The Allies had the factories, the Axis had the metallurgy, and between them lay the battlefield, where every pound of tungsten could mean a platoon's survival. The scarcity of tungsten would continue shaping weapons development even after the war, forcing nations to rethink how they built power into projectiles. In 1944, though, none of that mattered to the men fighting in the snow. They didn't care about supply lines or resource policies or metallurgical theory. They only cared that for once their shot might go through, and soon, in the frozen chaos of the Ardennes, that shot would echo through history. December 19, 1944, the Ardennes, Belgium. The snow fell thick and silent, muffling the thunder of distant artillery. Columns of American armor struggled through narrow forest roads, engines coughing in the bitter cold. The German counteroffensive, later known as the Battle of the Bulge, had taken everyone by surprise. The Wehrmacht's Panthers and Tigers cut through U.S. lines like blades through frost. Entire tank battalions were shattered. American crews fought delaying actions, buying time for reinforcements, but morale was crumbling. The Shermans once again were outgunned. In the chaos, a few crews carried something new: the M93 HVAP rounds that had arrived just weeks earlier. Each crew had been given perhaps 3 or 4. They were told to use them wisely. On the morning of the 19th, outside the village of St. Vith, a Sherman from the 7th Armored Division took up a defensive position on a snow-covered ridge. The commander, Lieutenant Charles Bogus, scanned the tree line through his binoculars. His radio crackled. Panthers advancing from the south, at least 3. They had the high ground, but little else. Standard 76mm AP shells were nearly useless against frontal hits, and retreat wasn't an option. The crew knew what was coming. They loaded their HVAP. Moments later, dark shapes emerged through the fog, low silhouettes, unmistakable. Panthers. The lead German tank fired first. Its 75mm round slammed into the frozen earth just short of the ridge, throwing snow and dirt against the Sherman's hull. The gunner adjusted his sight, exhaled, and pressed the trigger. The 76mm roared. The tungsten core of the HVAP shell streaked across 800 yards, striking the Panther dead center on its glacis plate. For a moment, nothing. Then a burst of orange flame as smoke poured from its hatches. The round had punched straight through, hit confirmed, the loader shouted. The second Panther turned its turret toward the ridge, but the Sherman had already reloaded. Another HVAP screamed downrange. It struck just below the mantlet, penetrated, and detonated inside. 2 Panthers destroyed. In under a minute. What had once seemed impossible was now real. Nearby units, hearing the explosions, thought artillery had struck. But it wasn't artillery. It was the 76mm Sherman finally fighting on equal terms. Across the front, similar scenes played out in fragments, isolated units using HVAP to hold their ground against heavier German tanks. At Bastogne, a Sherman platoon ambushed a German column emerging from the woods. With HVAP loaded, they scored 3 kills in rapid succession. The Panthers burned where they stood, their crews stunned at being defeated head-on. German reports from the same week reflected growing confusion. Enemy tank fire penetrates frontal armor at 700 meters. Unconfirmed if new gun or new ammunition. To the Americans, those words meant victory, not just tactical but moral. Every successful penetration was proof that they were no longer helpless. At night, tank crews gathered in snow-dug positions, sharing what little HVAP they had left. Some passed shells between tanks before battle, deciding who would carry the kill shots. Others marked the rounds with chalk crosses, symbols of hope in the freezing dark. But even in triumph, there was frustration. Most units still had only standard ammunition. Many tankers fought entire engagements without a single HVAP round to fire. For them, the fear returned every time a Panther appeared in the distance. Still, the reports from those few who had used it began circulating upward. Battalion logs noted, HVAP extremely effective against Panther tanks. Urgent need for increased supply. Ordnance officers took notice. Within weeks, shipments were redirected and new production orders were placed. The tungsten bottleneck remained a problem, but the priority had shifted. The front lines had spoken, the HVAP worked, and the Germans knew it too. Their own analysts began testing captured American ammunition, shocked by the tungsten core's efficiency. Orders were issued to reinforce Panther armor and avoid open duels with 76mm Shermans at range, a stunning reversal of previous doctrine. The hunter had become cautious. By Christmas Eve, word had spread across U.S. armored divisions. The new ammo works. Crews carried that phrase like a prayer into battle. The snow kept falling, the forests burned, and the balance of fear began to tilt. In that bitter winter, something subtle but profound shifted in the psychology of the war. The Sherman, the tank that symbolized sacrifice and was no longer fighting from beneath. It was finally striking back, and as the Ardennes burned, that single technological leap began rewriting the rules of tank warfare itself. By early January 1945, the tide in the Ardennes had begun to turn. The once unstoppable German offensive was running out of fuel, men, and time. But deep within the forests and frozen hills, armored duels continued with brutal intensity. For American tank crews, the lessons of the first encounters with HVAP were spreading fast. They now understood what their weapons could truly do and, more importantly, when and how to use them. At a forward base near Houffalize, a maintenance team worked under dim lanterns, reloading ammunition racks on a row of battle-worn Shermans. The snow outside glowed faintly under a full moon. Mechanic Sergeant Halley, who'd seen his fair share of burned-out tanks, watched as loaders carefully counted each precious HVAP shell. 5 per tank, he muttered. That's all they sent us. Each one of those rounds was worth its weight in gold, quite literally. Tungsten, the heart of the HVAP, was as rare as it was vital. Every shell represented a logistical miracle, pulled from the same strategic stockpiles used for armor-piercing bombs and aircraft cannons. That night, as the mechanics worked, a reconnaissance unit returned from the front with news. The Germans were massing armor south of the Somme River. Panthers, jagged Panthers, even a few of the monstrous Tiger IIs. If they broke through, the road to Liège would be open again. By dawn, the Shermans of the 2nd Armored Division rolled out. The air was sharp and silent, their tracks biting into frozen ground. The men inside were quiet, not with fear but focus. They had seen what the HVAP could do. At the village of Touraine, the first engagement came. A Panther, concealed behind a farmhouse, fired the opening shot. The shell ripped through the front wall of a nearby barn, showering the Americans with debris. The Sherman's commander ducked instinctively, then barked the order. Gunner, front. HVAP! The loader slammed the round into the breech. The gunner's sight steadied on the faint muzzle flash that betrayed the Panther's position. On the way, the 76mm fired, its tungsten core slicing through the cold morning air. The shot struck the Panther's lower glacing, a weak point few dared aim for before. The result was devastating. The German tank erupted in smoke, its turret hatch blasting open like a pressure valve. The Americans cheered, a brief explosive release of tension, but the battle wasn't over. Another Panther appeared, flanking from the left. Its shot hit home, tearing through a nearby Sherman and setting it ablaze. The survivors scrambled out, diving for cover in the snow. The remaining American tanks repositioned, using hedgerows for concealment. This time they fired in coordination, 3 guns, 1 target, 1 standard AP, 1 HE, 1 HVAP. The HE round shattered the Panther's cover. The AP ricocheted off harmlessly, but the HVAP penetrated through the smoke, punching clean through the turret ring. Another kill. What followed was less a battle and more a duel of wits. Crews learned to bait Panthers into exposing their sides, to time shots between reloads, and to aim low where armor was thinnest. And now, with HVAP in their arsenal, those tactics could actually work. Word began to spread beyond the Ardennes. Reports from Italy and Alsace showed similar success. Sherman crews who had once dreaded facing German heavy armor now hunted it with confidence. A letter from a tank commander to his wife, dated January 10, 1945, read, "We've got a new round that burns right through their best tanks. It's the first time I've seen them back away from us." For the first time since North Africa, morale among Allied tankers soared. They no longer felt like the underdogs in a rigged fight. Meanwhile, the Germans were noticing. Field reports from the Panzer Lehr Division described encounters with enemy armor capable of penetrating at ranges previously considered safe. Commanders warned their crews to engage only from ambush, to avoid open ground, a grim acknowledgement that the days of unchallenged superiority were over. Behind the lines, the U.S. Ordnance Department rushed to increase HVAP production. Factories in Pennsylvania and Illinois began operating around the clock. Engineers streamlined designs, and the supply of tungsten from liberated France and Portugal was prioritized for tank ammunition. Each passing week, more crates of M93 HVAP shells arrived at the front. Each week, more Sherman crews gained the weapon that could change the outcome of a duel. By mid-January, the Allies were no longer just holding the line, they were pushing back. German tanks, slowed by fuel shortages and relentless artillery, found themselves hunted. A Sherman platoon near La Roche ambushed a retreating Panther column at dusk. In less than 3 minutes, 4 Panthers were destroyed, each by precise HVAP hits from over 700 yards. Not a single Sherman was lost. That engagement, and dozens like it, signaled the beginning of the end for German armored dominance. The Panther was still powerful, the Tiger still terrifying. But now the men who faced them had a weapon of equal weight, and the courage to use it. In the forests of Belgium, among the snow and smoke, the balance of fear had shifted. Steel no longer dictated the outcome. Skills and innovations did. And with that shift, the final chapters of the war in Europe began to take shape. Before the HVAP, tank ammunition was locked in an old equation. More velocity meant more weight, and more weight meant less speed. That paradox had defined armor-piercing shells for years. But as the war evolved, so did the science of ballistics. The HVAP round was the answer to a question the battlefield had been asking since 1941. How do you destroy superior armor without building a heavier gun? The concept came from the labs of Watertown Arsenal in Massachusetts, the U.S. Army's secret crucible for metallurgical innovation. Engineers there had been studying German tungsten cord shells captured in North Africa. What they found was revolutionary. Instead of relying on sheer mass, these rounds concentrated their energy into a smaller, denser core that could slice through steel like a spear through glass. The American version, designated the M93 HVAP, high-velocity armor piercing, was a triumph of material science. At its heart was a solid tungsten carbide core, encased in a lightweight aluminum body and tipped with a hardened steel cap. This design gave the projectile extraordinary velocity, over 3,400 feet per second, compared to the roughly 2,600 feet of standard armor-piercing rounds. When fired, the aluminum body would strip away, leaving only the tungsten core to continue at blistering speed, focusing its kinetic energy on a pinpoint area of the target's armor. The result was devastating. Armor that had previously shrugged off Allied shells could now be perforated cleanly, sometimes even at long range. It wasn't magic. It was physics perfected for war. In tests conducted at Aberdeen Proving Ground, the M93 HVAP showed penetration results that stunned observers. At 500 yards, it could pierce 5 inches of sloped armor, something unheard of for a 76mm gun. Suddenly, the Sherman, once dismissed as outgunned, could take on a Panther frontally under the right conditions. This success didn't just change the balance of tank combat. It rewrote the American approach to weapon development. Instead of chasing bigger guns, engineers began optimizing ammunition, wringing every ounce of performance from existing platforms. But the path to battlefield adoption wasn't smooth. Tungsten, essential for HVAP production, was among the rarest strategic materials in the Allied inventory. It came mostly from China and Portugal, and both routes were perilous, the former under constant Japanese threat, the latter dependent on delicate diplomacy with neutral Portugal. As a result, each HVAP round was treated like treasure. Tank crews were issued small quantities, usually 5 per vehicle, and ordered to use them only against German heavy armor. Many units even marked HVAP shells with chalk or tape to avoid confusion in the heat of battle. Despite the scarcity, the psychological effect was enormous. Crews knew they had something powerful, something that could give them a fighting chance. The round's introduction also forced the Germans to adapt. Reports from Panzertruppen units noted increasing instances of penetration at unexpected angles and ranges. Tank commanders began reinforcing their vehicles with improvised side skirts and additional plates, though these measures did little to stop tungsten. The German High Command, alarmed by the reports, accelerated production of Scherzen armor and even considered reintroducing spaced armor designs from earlier prototypes. But these were desperate measures in a war already slipping away. On the Allied side, the HVAP's success fueled further innovation. By late 1944, new variants were being tested for the 90mm gun of the M36 Jackson and M26 Pershing. The same principle, light casing, dense core, extreme velocity, would later evolve into the APCR and APDS rounds of the post-war era, the direct ancestors of modern kinetic penetrators used in tanks today. Yet, behind every technical triumph was a human story, of the engineers who designed it, and the crews who trusted it with their lives. At the Watertown Arsenal, an engineer named Dr. Harry Watson wrote in his 1945 field report, "The tungsten core gives not only greater penetration, but greater confidence. The men know they can face what was once impossible. Confidence, and that was the hidden effect of HVAP. Not just a weapon, but a morale shift. A symbol that the underdog could still win through ingenuity." As January turned to February and the snow in the Ardennes began to melt into mud, the impact of this breakthrough became clear. German armor was retreating. American crews were advancing. Cautiously, confidently. For every Panther knocked out, for every Tiger crippled, the legend of the HVAP grew. It became the whispered secret of tankers, the round that could save your crew. And as the front lines pushed east toward the Rhine, the legacy of that small tungsten core, forged in science, baptized in fire, would carry through every mile of liberated Europe. Because in the end, the HVAP wasn't just about defeating a tank. It was about proving that American innovation could match and overcome German engineering on its own terms, and that realization would echo far beyond the forests of Belgium. By March 1945, the roar of tank engines was moving east. The forests of Belgium were quiet now, littered with burned-out wrecks, twisted turrets, and the blackened hulks of what had once been the pride of the Wehrmacht. On many of those destroyed Panthers, the clean round holes in their glacis plates told a new story. Not artillery, not airstrikes, but direct hits from 76-meter guns, impossible only months before. The psychological shift that HVAP brought was now visible across the European front. American armor divisions, once forced to avoid direct confrontation, began taking the fight to the Germans. The Sherman was no longer just a medium tank, it was a predator. Reports from the 3rd and 7th Armies described engagements where small platoons of Shermans, armed with limited HVAP stocks, destroyed Panther formations through precision and speed. The tactic had evolved: hit hard, hit fast, retreat into cover, and hit again. The Germans, already facing crippling fuel shortages, couldn't match this new aggression. Many Panthers were abandoned due to mechanical failures or lack of fuel before they could even fire. The technological gap that had once favored the Reich was closing, fast. In Eisenhower's headquarters, intelligence analysts began compiling data from field commanders. One summary dated February 12, 1945, read, Recent reports confirm the M93 HVAP projectile has altered tank engagements in favor of Allied units. Penetration results against German heavy tanks are satisfactory up to 800 yards frontal. Troops report increased morale and tactical flexibility. It was the kind of document that made generals take notice. For the first time since the early stages of the war, American crews could fight without fear of inevitable defeat in an armored duel. They still respected the Panther and Tiger. No one underestimated them, but the dread had lifted. In the field, tankers developed rituals around their HVAP rounds. Some kept one marked shell in reserve, their guardian angel. Others painted tungsten stripes on their turrets after confirmed Panther kills. For soldiers who had lived through the horror of being outgunned, this new power carried emotional weight. At the same time, German morale began to fracture. The Panzer divisions, once the unstoppable spearhead of Blitzkrieg, now found themselves hunted and outmatched in speed, logistics, and adaptability. Captured reports from Panzerlehr and 2nd SS Panzer Division described crews frustrated by the Americans' improved ammunition and tactics. One officer wrote bitterly, "The enemy's shells now pierce where we thought ourselves invincible. Our advantage in armor is gone." In truth, the HVAP round didn't just pierce steel. It pierced the myth of German invulnerability. As the Allies crossed the Rhine in March, the once vaunted armored divisions of the Reich were collapsing under a combined storm of firepower and attrition. Every HVAP shell fired was a message. The era of German dominance in tank warfare was ending. By the time U.S. forces reached the Elbe River, tungsten stocks were nearly depleted. The Ordnance Department rationed the last of the HVAP rounds to elite armored battalions, but by then it hardly mattered. The enemy was retreating on every front, its armor reduced to scattered pockets of resistance. The 76mm HVAP had served its purpose, not as a war-winning miracle, but as a tool of parity, a bridge between technological inferiority and battlefield ingenuity. The Sherman was still vulnerable. It still burned easily when hit. But with HVAP it could now answer back, and that made all the difference. The battlefield had proven something vital. Even in the final months of war, innovation, not just numbers, could change the course of combat. From the ashes of destroyed Panthers and Tigers, a new doctrine of warfare was born, one where speed, accuracy, and science mattered more than brute steel. And for the Americans, that lesson would define the tank battles of the future. The war in Europe ended in May 1945, but the story of the HVAP round, and the science behind it, was only beginning. When the guns fell silent, Allied researchers swarmed the ruins of Germany, studying every captured weapon and design. What they found confirmed what American engineers already suspected. The Germans, too, had been experimenting with tungsten-cored shells, known as PZGR-40. These were remarkably similar in concept to the HVAP, proof that both sides had reached the same technological frontier from opposite directions. But in the end, the difference lay in application. Where the Germans had used tungsten sparingly for elite units, the United States had turned it into a systemic advantage, rapidly testing, refining, and distributing the HVAP to the front. It was not perfection that won. It was speed of adaptation. Still, the cost had been immense. Tungsten reserves, already limited, were nearly exhausted. After the war, U.S. intelligence classified tungsten as a strategic material, placing it alongside uranium and oil in national security planning. The government began securing foreign sources, in Portugal, Burma, and Bolivia, to ensure America would never again face a shortage in a critical war material. In laboratories across the United States, engineers who had cut their teeth designing the HVAP began working on next-generation ammunition. The challenge was clear: how to maintain penetration power without depending on tungsten's rarity. Their answer came in the post-war years with the armor-piercing discarding, Sabot APDS, and later APFSDS rounds, direct descendants of the HVAP principle. Instead of a full-size shell, these new designs used a narrow, dart-like penetrator encased in a lightweight sabot that peeled away after firing, allowing the dense core to continue at extreme velocity. The physics were the same. The packaging was evolved. By the 1950s, these new rounds were standard in NATO arsenals, giving tanks like the M48 Patton and M60 the power to destroy Soviet armor from long range. The lineage was undeniable. Every modern kinetic round, from the Cold War to the present day, owes its ancestry to the humble HVAP. But beyond engineering, HVAP left a deeper mark on doctrine and mindset. Before its arrival, American tank crews were taught to avoid German heavy armor unless supported by artillery or air power. After HVAP, the doctrine shifted toward confidence and initiative. Tank commanders learned to exploit speed and precision, rather than rely solely on numbers. The weapon didn't just improve their firepower, it changed the way they thought about battle. As the U.S. entered the Cold War, that mindset became crucial. Facing the vast armor formations of the Soviet Union, Western planners leaned on the same principle the HVAP had proven. Superiority could come from innovation, not just armor thickness or gun caliber. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union studied the Allied HVAP and developed its own equivalents, the BR-354P and later the 3BM series, both inspired by the same tungsten core concept. Thus, the arms race that began in the snowy forests of Belgium quietly evolved into a global competition in materials science. By the 1960s, every major power fielded high-velocity penetrators made from tungsten or depleted uranium, a direct continuation of the HVAP's legacy. But for the men who had first loaded those rounds in 1944, the memory remained personal. Many veterans later spoke of HVAP with a reverence usually reserved for luck or faith. One tanker from the 4th Armored Division recalled, "When we got the tungsten shells, it was like someone finally gave us a fair fight. You could look a Panther dead in the eye and not feel helpless." That was the true victory of the HVAP, not just in destroyed tanks, but in restored courage. It was proof that American science and determination could bridge any gap, even in the darkest winter of the war. And in the decades that followed, every new tank, every new shell, every test of metal and fire would carry a silent echo from that moment in 1944, when a single tungsten core, fired from a 76mm gun, shattered both steel and fear. War is remembered in explosions, in the roar of engines, the flash of fire, the wreckage left behind. But the real revolutions often happen in silence, in a lab, in a workshop, in the minds of people who refuse to accept defeat. The HVAP round was never a headline weapon. It didn't inspire propaganda posters or grand speeches. It was a quiet invention, a handful of engineers and metallurgists asking a simple question: what if we could make something faster, sharper, smarter? And through that question, they gave thousands of soldiers a fighting chance. For the men inside Shermans, it wasn't just a new shell. It was hope shaped in metal. Hope that they could finally face the enemy on equal ground. Hope that science, not superstition or fear, could decide who lived to see the next dawn. That's what made it powerful. The HVAP didn't change history through scale. It changed it through balance, turning weakness into resilience and doubt into resolve. It proved that the outcome of war is not only forged by the strongest armies, but by the smallest breakthroughs, the ones that bridge the gap between survival and destruction. In the grand sweep of history, it sits as a symbol of ingenuity under fire, a reminder that even in the harshest winter of war, the mind remains humanity's most formidable weapon. And perhaps that is the truest legacy of all, that amid the thunder of tanks and the collapse of empires, victory was found not in the roar of machines, but in the precision of thought, the courage to innovate, and the belief that knowledge itself can save lives. The war would move on. The world would rebuild. But in every modern tank shell, every tungsten dart, and every soldier who trusts his tools, the spirit of that 76mm HVAP round still burns, a spark born from necessity, refined by science, and remembered forever as the moment when American steel learned to strike back,